to meet more of you tomorrow. I just feel so lucky and honored actually to be here, and so thankful for my time at Cranbrook, but also specifically my time with Fiber, which is a very, each department is unique, but finding grounding in conversations that I had with Fiber, and still finding that grounding even in the conversation some of us had today. So I just want to say thank you, and I hope that you all are very proud of yourselves, because some awesome work is coming out of your department. So I hope you ride that wave. So we're going to get started here, and I hope I can, oh, here we go. I hope I can see you while I do this. I can, great. So my name is Jova, and as Mark read in my bio, I'm from New York City, born and raised. And tonight's conversation was going to be more so about balancing life as a curator, artist, and all the things. And after today's conversations, I actually feel like I should talk more about my practice. So I've shifted the conversation a little bit based on some things that we talked about. And one of those things that we talked about today is obsession. And so obsession, the state of being obsessed with someone or something, and thinking about materiality and obsession with material. Specifically, when I think about obsession and sort of archiving these materials from my personal lineage. Of course, we have Mariah Carey's "Why Are You So Obsessed With Me?" Articulating the obsession with a human. And then we have just the things I'm obsessed with, like eating food. Audre Lorde, critical womanist, theorist, writer, amazing person who truly believes that women are powerful and dangerous, and I share that belief. Weapons of all kinds, specifically knives. And then my mother, who is in the center of this photograph. My mom actually passed away in November of 2020. And so all my work has been about her. But as I process the loss of her grief, the work is actually, the grief of her loss, the work is actually shifting really quickly. And so how can I still honor this obsession I have while processing this grief is something that I've been thinking about. And so my work it's really split into two different bodies of work that I actually started at Cranbrook and I'm not done with yet. I'm still meeting it, but it's sort of founded on this notion of the brutally soft woman. So I am a brutally soft woman, which is a poem by Naraya Waheed. And this is the most recent video that I've made, sort of looking or thinking about this duality of both the brutal and the soft.
Jewels and tinsel from the tub, and laugh, gaily or vengeful.
And so this video that we just saw is an excerpt of a video from the original film For Colored Girls Who's Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, a 1974 film by Ntozake Shange. And so whenever I make a work, I usually first make a video or find my degree is in photography, but I'm rooted in video practice. And so I usually make a sketch of a video and then look at various materials, such as the interior of my family's album, to sort of translate this video into an object. And so this is often something that I repeat in my work. It goes video, object, photograph, video, object, photograph, video, object, photograph, very cyclical in its nature. And so this video that we saw is a work called Before I Let Go. And for Colored Girls, the author Ntozake creates these characters, and this video is focused on the lady in blue. And my interest in the lady in blue is sort of how one can carry this sadness and this joy at the same time. So in the video, she's laugh crying simultaneously. This is another work that I'll just play.
A fantastic new hairstyle. It's called an ultra natural, and it's got lots of ringlety curls all over your head, but soft. Just relax.
Meet Pam, Doreen, and Paula.
All three of them started by relaxing their hair with this.
She parted her hair down the middle and combed the crown.
And so, in addition to making these found footage videos as sketches, I should also say that these videos are referencing 1970s hypnosis films, which I'm also obsessed with. So thinking about the way advertisements sort of sell this idea of identity and what that meant for my mom's own upbringing is really what has inspired this work. And so this is an installation view. This was at something I did with Eugenie and Simone de Sousa Gallery in Detroit this fall, where the video was projected and then repeated on loop. And so this work, which is called Hair Like Mama's, which I actually made while I was a fiber elective at Cranbrook. I was started to think about sort of like reverse trajectory, thinking about the most intimate moments I had with my mother, and they were often between her legs, specifically when she was doing my hair, and wanted to sort of create a sort of archive for this experience of myself. And so I started making what I call a headless weave. And while I was in Cranbrook, I like kept being sort of adding to the weave until eventually in 2020, it became the body size of my mom and actually her weight at the time, because the weight of the material was so heavy. And so this project was ongoing until the point of her death, where I was using fake dreadlock synthetic hair and then using the weave to create a headless weave, essentially. And this piece being activated more so as a living archive, I didn't realize I was going to stop making it when she died, and maybe I will continue it again one day. But for now, it's this material that gives me this sort of way to understand how the weight of her could exist in my life as a weave. And I don't mean tapestry, I mean literally a weave. And I sort of, before that work, I had been really obsessed with throwing knives and shakes, which I said in the beginning of the lecture. And so this is a work that I actually made prior to the headless weave. And I show this work because I hate this work, actually. And I think that I had a lot of issues with this work. And Jasper Johns, everybody's like, Jasper Johns. And I'm just like, listen, I was just trying to make a map of the scalp of my hair and think about my mom and how like both the intimacy that I found in her doing my hair, but also I'm tender-headed, which basically means that my scalp is tender and I hate when people comb my hair. So I spent this one summer, all of these rat tail combs, sharpening them into very, very sharp, almost knife-like shanks. And so thinking about the throwing knife and the target of the head, and then the sort of way a head is mapped. And this work is actually fairly large, but it's the work that I have the trouble talking about the most. And I think part of it is because I don't know how to explain why I was so enamored by these combs and changing the function of the comb into something else. And so I think in some of our conversations earlier, we talked about failure and letting go and making work that is unexpected or that doesn't fall within certain paradigms of an institution or able to be digestible by the folks around you. And I share this work because it's still, again, the hardest work for me to explain. And also realizing that art is subjective. And so even if I do not see Jasper Johns in this, I see the top of my head, that doesn't mean somebody else won't. And being willing to relinquish that control as an artist and just let the work be what the work needs to be, which is something that I think I only really let myself do once I had left Cranbrook. This is called Bolust, which is also another piece I started at Cranbrook, really thinking about hair and weaponry and deconstructing hair bubbles or hair ties, which you see, and turning it into a rope, turning it into a violent weapon. So thinking about both and this futility of this act, as you actually can't use this as a weapon anyway. It's just simulated. And then still going back to video and wanting to make these videos because I felt like I owed it to my video artist self to make videos. And so this is a work, actually, Marcellus Armstrong, who's a fiber elective and one of my dear, dear friends. I personified him as a minister. And I should say my mom, when I was about 12 or 13, my mom became a minister. And in my life, we had been going to church regularly. But she sort of became this amalgamation of both these like preachers that I knew and also very much like an auntie uncle figure in her church. And I wasn't a member of her church, but seeing her shapeshift into that was super interesting for me as her child. And so these are stills from I only think I have 2 stills from a 3-channel work where the auntie, I will call her as Marcellus, is sort of giving me this baptism and giving me a relief, and all the hair that was collected in this work, because she's vigorously combing my hair, ended up in this piece, in the cement blocks that you see at the bottom. And while this was happening, I started that summer collecting white porcelain, which is a material that I renamed white fragility. There had been, I think that was the summer that Mike Brown was murdered. I can't even remember at this point. There's been so many murders, but really wanting to play with this idea of what's fragile and rage, and try to understand my rage, because I'm so obsessed with weapons and subversion of weapons, really wanting to go back and distill why I'm so enraged in the first place. And so I collected these materials, called it White Fragility, and invited Black female spectrum folks in my life to come into a red room and exercise have a cathartic exercise in rage. The title of this work is A Cathartic Exercise in Rage. And this is a participatory piece. And on the right-hand side is my mom, my sister, Ash, who's also an alum of Fiber, and my friend, Jay. And so this was the first time after, I made video of this work, I took photograph, but really the work exists mostly as a performance and as a sculpture. And last year I was able to do the 5th iteration of this work and present it in Philadelphia. And so you can see the white fragility, which has been exercised by people of African descent at the opening. I invited anybody who self-identified as of African descent to exercise their rage with me. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is an image of my mother who's gazing upon us as we sort of exercise this rage. And I was sharing with one of your classmates earlier about this work being a work that is my work, but also being a work that was made by a collective group of people. And those people have emerged and changed. So now it's maybe like 20 people have participated in this exercise, and wanting to play with materiality and titles in order to convey that this is not just mine. And so if you've looked at my website, you'll see the materials. I play with the traditional museum label. And so the work is by homies, and homies were born of when the first enslaved African came to this country. And so that's just an example of that. My first year at Cranbrook, this was actually the first video I ever made, and I'll play it for a second.
Over here, and this was a beautiful house at the time. Yeah, it was beautiful. I mean, full of antiques. These sofas are all things she had when my father was a kid. So this was all beautiful stuff. And why would she want to do that? Why would she be so cruel, to put us through that? Her great-grandchildren know that. And the only thing I could think, after talking to the doctors, after seeing Grandma go into dementia, he said, people are a product of where they come from.
Okay, so this is the video that actually began my obsession with understanding hypnosis videos. So I'm not going to play the whole thing, but essentially the woman who's talking is the mother of my friend who's carrying the dress. And when I first got to Detroit, I was really interested in this sort of notion of what's abandoned and what's not abandoned. And so I asked my friend to take me to every place she ever lived. And Mitch, we talked about this earlier, I think. And she took me to um, about 10 different homes around the city. And we ended up, we kept going back to her grandmother's house. And her grandmother's house, as you can see in the video, there's still a lot in the house, but all the windows and the doors were stripped. The steel was stripped, everything was gone except for these objects. And so in the video, and I tried with different cameras, cell phone, GoPro, Mark II, etc. And I ended up strapping the very last time we shot, I strapped a camera to Vanessa's chest, and she's walking around collecting the objects that are most important to her and creating this archive. And so that is the red dress at the beginning of the video is the red dress that is in this photograph. And at the time, I chose to make a knife, which represented the experience that Vanessa had shared with me of her grandmother. And so then was looking at these old advertisements and wanted to sort of shift the presentation of the body. So is it the knife or is it the body that allures you more in this photograph? And sort of appropriate those images. I did the same thing with my sister and the same thing with my mother. Which sort of leads me to the work of Soft Thrones, which is a body of work that actually is going to be in a show at Cranbrook, which just collected it, and so did the DIA. And these are photographs of LGBTQ Jamaicans in places where they felt the most powerful. And so what I do is in similar vein to the project that I just showed you, but is work with folks to have conversations around memory, identity development, and relationship to power and self. And so this is Ranisha, and this is Ranisha and Carrie, and people don't often see this image, but this was a couple, and this was their first time being photographed and their first time being paid to be in photographs. And so in my work, as these works sell, trying to be accountable to their stories, and every time a work sells, sending them a percentage of the funding that I get from those sales as a means to give back to keep having them, holding them as a part of the artistry in this work. But while this is happening, I'm doing portraiture. I'm still making object-based portraits. And so this is a work called Threshold. It's steel and velvet and a little bit of acrylic. And again, going back to, this is actually a portrait of my mom and my aunt, who are twins, and sort of thinking about my grandmother's gait. And so another obsession I have is with gaits. And sort of thinking about how they can be both soft and hard at the same time, and violent and sweet. So that's one body of work. And while I'm making all this work, I am also making another body of work. And I think Cranbrook has been super helpful in helping me, and I think I said this to Deja earlier, helping me figure out what is my practice and what is the work, right? And so this is me outside of a gate, which I'm very obsessed with, as we just saw with Threshold. And I'm standing next to my sister, and I'm about like 6 years old. And this photograph was taken outside of Gracie Mansion in New York City. And we had just left the park and we were at the sprinklers. And so being very aware that I wasn't allowed past this thing, but like still wearing my tropical bathing suit and wanting to be still like fantasize about being in another place with that. And so Visions of Paradise is essentially a tour through an imagined landscape called Paradise. It is based on this book that my mom and my aunt, who are pictured in the lower right, wrote. They wrote a environmental law sort of collection of essays and documents that sort of advocated for the reality that climate change was going to vastly change the Caribbean, and that if something didn't happen about climate change, and this is 1977 when the book was published, this photograph is from 1974, that the Caribbean one day wouldn't exist. And so I'm thinking to myself, how could the Caribbean not exist one day? And if it's gonna not exist, what are the things that one might remember? Specifically thinking about myself as both a tourist and a native of a place. And so I should also mention that when I was younger, before my mom became a minister, she was a travel agent. And so a lot of the work is derived from literally listening to her be a salesperson of a place that didn't actually exist. And so I started making these performance videos. In this work, which is an endurance performance, I eat a can of ackee, which is a fruit that is grown in Jamaica, but is poisonous if you don't eat it cooked. And so sort of digesting this, consuming this plant, this fruit, and to the point where I could not eat anymore and eating it anyway. So thinking about food as a way to sort of devour a place, but also what happens in the grief of a loss of a place. So I'm not going to show all the things, but I did it. I got through. All of it was eaten. I'm going to try to mute this person 1 second. I don't know if I can. Mark, I might need your help. But so this is where I start really embracing performance as a modality in the work, and create a character named Paradise, who is the architect of a place that doesn't exist. And so this is the first portrait of Paradise that I actually ever took. And so you see the machete, which is so like the signifiers in both Visions of Paradise and Sites of Power overlapping in certain respects. And actually, this was my thesis image. This was printed very large in the museum. I think it was like 17 feet. I can't remember, as like a sort of homage to a billboard. And thinking about, for me, like creating a setting that I never wanted Paradise herself to exist in any place that was real, and really wanting the hand and this sort of thinking about this person being so desperate to make this place real that it has to be unreal to become real. And so anytime Paradise is pictured, it's in these simulated settings. This is the tourist, who is both me and also a tourist. And the tourist does mundane activities, but hyper sensationalizes them. So in this video, the tourist goes to a coconut stand, gets a coconut, and then finds a coconut tree and sits on the I don't actually want to play the video. Sits on the coconut tree, but then can't get off the tree once she's done finishing. So looking at all of these, like walking on the beach. I have a series where the tourist is riding a horse for just around, and the tourist is just like, what's going on? Going to different locations of travel and just sort of being there, interacting with the space. This is actually a video of the tourist in Berlin at an abandoned airport that used to be one of the biggest. Europe extracted a ton of sugar from the Caribbean. And so this airport being a specific place or location where that import export happened. And then thinking about Paradise again. And so Paradise appearing as a parody of Chiquita Banana. This is another installation I made in grad school. This work was actually at the Brooklyn Museum, not displayed like this. So I've played with display a lot in my practice and thinking about what is the most sacred elements of the work and what's necessary versus not necessary. And then this is the travel agent, and the travel agent really being there these are a bunch of video stills from multi-channel work where she's, as well as a performative installation where she literally sells people tickets to Paradise. And so the image in the upper right-hand corner was taken at Pop's Packing, which is where I set up a place called Paradise Travel Company and embodied the travel agent, and would book people tickets to Paradise. And some people thought it was real, which was very interesting and challenging as I never broke character. And then at the end of your interaction with the travel agent, which like your interaction with her is all built on desire, right? So it's like, what do you desire in a travel experience? What do you desire as a souvenir, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end, you realize she's just typing the word paradise over and over and over. So it's actually a work within a work, and then that work is printed out and displayed. And so in my practice, because I'm really referring to all these things that are real and aren't real, this is an image, the most iconic image attributed to Jamaican tourism, which is a Trinidadian woman standing in a lake advertising Jamaica. And so I took Paradise to Lake Michigan and had her stand in Lake Michigan and wear a shirt that she made with Paradise on it, and sort of tried to rip off the original image, and appropriating also the text that came with the image. And so this is pretty much almost verbatim. The text on the left-hand side is ripped from the original ad, but I just replaced the word paradise, the word Jamaica, with the word paradise. And then Paradise fruit salad. This is another advertisement where I was looking at 1970s sort of recipes for Caribbean dishes and made a fruit salad. And all the objects that you see there are actually in this photograph. So the photograph came first and then recycled the fruit for this shoot. And digging my feet into ceramics. And so creating, when you interact with the tourist, she does a survey for your desires and you get to put what souvenirs you desire the most. And so I take those souvenirs and like the suggested souvenirs and then make them. And this is sort of the most recent photograph. It's a triptych, and there's a ton of flocking. I love flocking so much, like this velvet look. I just like, I can't get over it. And so trying to make this is called 1, 2, 3. And so 1, 2, 3, looking at the way we identified numbers and colors. They're the Rastafarian flag colors as well. And everything that you see in this was created with the hand, including the backdrops. And the tourist again. So while I'm making all that work, I'm also curating, and this is where my technology failed me. So I'm going to be doing a lot more talking than showing, just so you all know. And so I graduated from Cranbrook, and I had worked at museums on the East Coast and the West Coast prior to going to grad school. And once I finished grad school, I was like, what the hell am I going to do? I want to stay in Detroit, and where am I going to work? And MOCAD had a curatorial fellowship. And so I was like, well, I've been doing stuff in museums. Let me just see if I can work at another museum. And I was actually hired the same day that their former senior curator, I was offered the job the same day that it had been released that the former curator was facing several allegations of sexual assault. And so when I got the phone call, the director at the time said, I'm sure you've seen art news. And so just so you know, if you take this job, you're going to be on your own. And I was like, okay, I guess it's fine. It's a job. I need to pay bills. Cool. And that actually really caused something called Imposter Syndrome, which I'm sure many of us have faced or are facing or are trying to deal with, which I find this definition to be super interesting, which is loosely defined as doubting your abilities and feeling like a fraud. It disproportionately affects high achieving people who find it difficult to accept their accomplishments. Many question whether they're deserving of the accolades, followed by this article that says, stop telling women they have imposter syndrome. And sort of that like juxtaposition of those things is like really fascinating to me, especially because at the time, I think I was like 28 or 29, and I was just out of grad school, and I was like, how am I going to make all of these things work? And so I The first show that I did was a massive retrospective of the artist Tyree Guyton. For those of you who are familiar with Detroit, he is the artist behind the Heidelberg Project. And he has both a Heidelberg Project and actually a studio practice. And so navigating 30 years within 1 year to put this show together was the gauntlet of curatorial for me. It was just like hit the ground running and let's go. And so this is just an installation view of that exhibition. And something I should be transparent about is that I do not like curate it. I try really hard to not curate work that looks like mine or deals with the same topics as in my practice. I really appreciate getting to know artists whose practices overlap with my artistic practice. But in order for me to have a boundary between my curatorial life and my artist life, I feel like it's necessary for me to create that space. So although I am interested in things like materiality and function within my own practice, when it comes to curation, I try not to work with artists who I'm in the same canon with, if that makes sense. And that's like a very personal choice, but a very real one. And so I started at MOCAD in 2017. And the slides where I talk about MOCAD resistance are missing here, Mark, but I'm going to talk about it. And so this summer, the summer of 2020, I would say that there was a cultural renaissance in the world. We were facing the pandemic. Black Lives Matter. George Floyd was murdered by Derek Kavanaugh. And so we have Breonna Taylor, who was also murdered, just these series of murders and this clear disparity when it came to practices regarding labor, race, gender. And so I was in the middle of, I had just finished curating a photo exhibition called Crossing Night. And I had done a lot of work on that show. And the pandemic hit and my mom had an autoimmune disease. And so I was really concerned about her. And none of us were working at the museum. And the director was sort of trying to figure out how to like navigate people not working on site, but still running a place such as a museum, which is like really rooted in people being able to go. And so while this is happening, I should say my time at MOCAD was challenging. I was very driven to produce, I think I've done 7 shows at this point, maybe 8. And I've only been there for 4 years total. And so that's a lot of work in a very short amount of time. And sort of realizing that while I was doing this work, the best practices the best labor practices were not being met. And I started to realize this, and my colleagues started to realize this. And so once the pandemic really hit, we were able to finally talk to each other about the failure of the museum and sort of the failures to keep us safe and to keep the public safe. And through all of that, I was laid off, and the director called me one day and asked me if I could be in Detroit to work. And I had gone to the East Coast to check out my mom. And she asked me to be back in Detroit 2 days later. And I said no. And she was like, well, if you don't come back, then you won't have a job. And I said, okay. And it was a very threatening and very horrible situation to go through, particularly as I was experiencing so much death around me, and both in my life and in the society. It was too much. And I had my family support. And this was not the first time I was put in a precarious situation with the director. And as I said, like, institutions are designed to separate people, to sort of make one think in a more individualistic way rather than a collective way. And so now that staff was talking about it and sharing stories, all of this sort of horrible way that she had treated us in the past, including apologizing, being a sexual assault apologizer, saying like blatantly racist things, having us work overtime, yelling at us constantly. We came together, and the curatorial fellow at the time, who I was mentoring, Tiziana Baldinabro, wrote a letter to the board and exposed everything that Alicia was doing. And as a result of an investigation that I can't talk about, the director was let go. And I ended up rejoining the museum about 3 months after this all happened. I will say that museums are predicated on a history of colonization, and that colonization is violence. And so, or is rooted in violence. And working at an institution that was actually started by art writers, people who were invested in the arts. MOCAD is about 15 years old, maybe 17 years old. And so because of MOCAD's sort of unique positioning, the museum was ripe and ready for change. And although a lot has changed, there's still a long way to go. And so my decision to return was really to try to facilitate this process where artists could be empowered again, and where the museum could serve the community more effectively, especially as MOCAD is a non-collecting institution. And so it took over 70 plus former staff members, as well as over 300 local artists, signing on to various letters of support for this change for MOCAD to like finally agree and commit to investigating its practices and committing to uplifting Detroit, specifically Indigenous communities, and treating staff better. And so you can go to mocadresistance.com to learn more about that movement. I don't think it's unique. I would say a lot of museums are grappling with these issues. And I want to say, especially because you all are in grad school, it's important to remember that museums can't exist without artists, neither can galleries, neither can any space where you exhibit. Artists can have exhibits or present work without these institutions. And so artists really have a lot more power than I think we have. I think there's this desperation mode that we go into where it's like, gotta have a show, gotta show the work, gotta get it together. And as somebody who traverses both of these landscapes, I feel it's always important to remind folks, these places can't exist without you and your work and your creativity. So never feel like you owe somebody something. Actually advocate for yourself when you're in these situations. And so my passion project is Bulk Space, which is a collective of artists and art organizers working to uplift the craft of marginalized voices. We run exhibitions, workshops, have publications, and do virtual residencies. And so this is a collective that I started actually with Meg, who's the image below me, and Claire, who are both graduates from photo department at Cranbrook as well. Sarah Nishikawa, who is a ceramics alumni from Cranbrook, and then Jessica Ali, who is a Detroiter who currently works at Red Bull Arts Detroit. And so we have a former church that's called Bulk Sanctuary, where we present exhibitions, we host workshops. Most recently, I did a workshop with a tech company about just like uplifting voices in the time of COVID, and made this bizarre video for them, which now they own. It's so weird, like how these things work. But just like reflecting the inconsistencies in tech companies through art. And so that's like sort of a part of the mission of this. We do have an open call. Unfortunately, you cannot apply because you can't be a student when you apply, but we do have more residency opportunities in the future. So for those of y'all who stay local, please follow us because we're super interested in working with folks. I would also say, just in terms of additional advice, it's so important to, like, if you have an idea, just reach out to folks who see if they know somebody or who can support that idea and or a presentation. I think, and that's something that's really specific to Detroit, I think. is the city is based on relationships. So the relationships you build will be reflected in the opportunities that you get. And so even if somebody approaches me and is like, I want to do an installation at MoCAD or at Bulk Space and it can't work out, who else do I know who can support it? You know, how can we use this networks to take care of each other and uplift each other's careers while we're in that process? I will also say, although I don't like it so much, I always read cold asks that I get, which not every person does, but I actually really enjoy them. And most museum curators will do it. It's just we don't talk about it. So when I say I don't like this, it's mostly like, I don't like talking about this, but it is a obvious secret in the art world that people do read the cold ask emails, even if they don't respond. And so this is my website. You guys should check it out. I just feel like I steamrolled that whole presentation, but where did you guys go? Where am I? Am I here? Okay, yes, I'm here. But that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jova. That was great. Are you up for a few questions if there's some out there?
Yeah.
Great. Put them in the, amazing in the chat. Cool. You can either put them in the chat and I'll read them, or you can just raise your hand and pipe up. Oh,
hi.
Ryan, right?
Yes. Hi. Thanks, Mark. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. I was curious just on one of the last segments in your presentation, you mentioned something that I'd like to learn more about as myself a new artist, which is that museums are predicated on a history of colonization, and my current work deals with these sorts of subjects. So I'm wondering what that history is a little bit.
Ooh, that history is long. That history is wild.
Yeah.
I think so. There's one book that might be helpful, which is called Breaching the Margins. And it's actually about a social movement that happened in 1973, specifically at the Whitney, where Black artists and artists of color approached the museum and basically said, why aren't we being collected? What's going on? And so that book sort of untangles a lot of the history that got the museum to that place. And so this is something really weird, but the museum and the zoo have a lot in common. And so a zoo being a place where, and actually there is a really amazing, I know I shouldn't tell you to watch this, but there's a funny drunk history about this. Comedy Central drunk history, you can Hulu it. It's super weird, but it's there, where they talk about the history specifically of the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, which like for me was a staple growing up in New York. The circus would come and whatever. But the way basically this collector who is invested in zoos, which zoos up until like the 1940 something World Fair used to show people, specifically Black people, disabled people, people with different genetic sort of non-traditional genetic makeups in zoos. And so the history of the zoo and the history of the museum are directly in conversation, because in Europe, this guy was super invested in zoos. And then he was just like, okay, what about things that are deceased? And the history of archaeology, specifically, like you can think about Egypt, for example, and collecting these things and then wanting to display it for the public to see. And so this guy who was deeply invested in zoos, became super invested in museums and displaying these like unnatural creatures, which turned into paintings, which turned into sculpture, which turns into 2D, 3D works. And so really, in order to understand the history of museums, I really recommend that book. Also just like going into documentary film about the history of museums and zoos. It's super weird. You get into a rabbit hole. I'm warning you now, it's not pretty, but the entanglement of what is precious and what is sacred. And so in this new movement, you have, in terms of institutional life and shifting institutional life, I think a lot of art workers and curators are sort of grappling with, how do you create change when the institution itself is predicated and rooted in this disenfranchisement of a people, whether it's objects like Native American objects from Africa that are now being repatronized, I can't remember the word, but basically given back to the cultures in which they came from, or it's presenting sort of this idealization of these painters that really also appropriated different cultures. And so it's super interesting. And I think part of why I touch on that is because I do think it is actually possible to do that work of decolonizing the museum and really making it reflect the community in which the museum is located and challenging assumptions, right? Art is so personal and it's also so political. And even though all the work I make comes from a very personal place, as I've shared with you all, it's going to be politicized. And so I like to remind artists that we actually have the power to be a part of that decolonization and a part of that change. Because again, museums can't exist without us. But I would also encourage you to look at histories of non-collecting institutions, because those are the institutions that tend to be a little bit more radical in terms of the process of decolonization. Because when you don't have a collection, on one hand, it's challenging because then you need to fundraise for every show. But on the other hand, then you're not keeping these objects you're not keeping these objects that represent the legacy of colonization in a sense. I will also note that the art field, specifically the visual arts, is the only field where artists are not afforded royalties for their work. Writers get royalties, so do musicians. And so what does it mean to create a visual work of art? Or something I'm asking myself is, what does it mean to produce this, to sell it to a collector, and for it to sell one day, maybe for $1 million, but for me and my family never to see a penny of that? What is that impact long term? And so I'm hoping that these conversations about decolonizing the museum and a serious look at what royalties for visual arts would be happen in tandem. And they are happening. But I think the more that young artists or emerging artists know about this, the better the field will be. That was a really long way to answer that question. I'm sorry. I found so many rabbit holes.
Mirav, do you want to?
Yeah, I had a question about your process with Soft Thrones and how you went about reaching out to people that you photographed, and how much kind of backhand planning went into that, and if you knew the subjects or was it kind of cold call when you went to go visit, and just curious about that project.
Oh, so I have my family's from Kingston, so I did travel to Kingston very often. And I had a really close friend who I met, who actually did a residency here. I brought her to Detroit to do a residency. And then I was like, we need to keep this exchange going. And so she went back to Jamaica, and she actually lives not too far away from where my family grew up. And so we started this friendship. She's a sound artist, and I was like, I want to do this project. Can you, she ran a radio station where like local, mostly LGBTQ young people would come. And I was like, can you help me think about anybody in the community who you would think would benefit from participating? And so it was a lot of trust. I ended up working on the curriculum for the workshops, but I also participated and didn't facilitate, even though I helped with the curriculum, because I wanted participants to trust me too, and to be able to be vulnerable as a way to sort of build community with them. And, you know, I spent just like basically every day with them for almost a month. And it was really beautiful and really amazing, also really sad and intense. And so I wanted to be very clear with them, like I am of Kingston, but my life is so different being American too. And so just moving through any hiccups we had by being patient and really leaning on my friends to support me and the participants through it. And, you know, one of the things about the couple who I showed in the photograph is they live together, but they each have a kid, so that part of why one of them had a kid was so people wouldn't think she was gay. And so like, how am I responsible for that story is really intense. And how do I share that story? And so a lot of artists choose not to have conversations with participants about how the story is represented. I choose to have those conversations to know people's boundaries. And sometimes that can mean the work has to change. And sometimes it can mean that might mean it's not as strong as I want it to be, but it's still the most respectful thing. So I would say for me, it's really following my intuition and trying to meet folks where they're at. And prior to actually Vanessa's, which is the red dress, I actually didn't put other people in my work. I didn't want to have that responsibility, but I think it's actually super important to hold that, and to really be in a place where you're willing to relinquish control. Because you can't, once you're involving other people and choosing participants in that way, you just have to trust the process. So yeah.
Hi, Jova. I'm just curious if I'm a second year, so I'm like on my way out of this whole grad school level and like probably sticking around Detroit. So I'm just curious, like, if you have any basic advice, like what you think is like do's and don'ts as I'm like crossing this threshold, you know, like for how to keep your head in it, how to like keep talking to the right people, and like what you think, I don't know.
I think it's important to recognize that Detroit is not a blank slate. And the best advice I got before I moved here was don't treat Detroit like there's nothing going on. Be a part of Detroit. And so that advice has really been helpful to me as I navigate this place. I would say putting yourself out there to meet other artists. I mentioned to Melissa earlier, like Pops Packing, Faina is awesome. Simone is awesome. Simone DeSouza is awesome. Like all of these people who run these artist spaces as arts administrators are also artists. And like Public Pool is an awesome place. I think when you get into, as you like, even just show up and meet people. I can't tell you how many people, my colleague Zeb is amazing. And he just knows all these people. And then you're just like, oh, like, I get like, when I'm thinking about something, I'll be like, Zeb, do you know anybody who can do this? And he'll be like, yeah, so-and-so. And so really investing time here and building those relationships. And if you don't have them or you feel like you lack access to them, tap into your alumni network. Like the alumni, Cranbrook alumni in Detroit is strong, like wowzers. And so almost everybody's been to Cranbrook who like, that's not true, but I think you catch my drift. I just would say lean into that alumni network and invest time in that network, and then just put yourself out there and show up at events and introduce yourself to people. People love meeting people. And I know it's a time of COVID, but I still think putting oneself out there, even if you attend an event virtually, like there are some people who I know go to everything and like I recognize their name, even if I've never met them. And then maybe an opportunity comes up and I'm like, okay, who is this person who asked me this question during this talk and how can I reach out to them? But that's really predicated on the time and investment you put into relationships.
Go, Deja.
So my biggest question is like, so I understand the networking thing, but you know, I'm a Detroiter and I'm like, I want to stay in Detroit. I don't care what anybody says. But I constantly get this like, but if you get this, you know, this thing across the world or blah, 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 like, how do you keep motivated with being here, if that makes any sense? I hope that.
How do I keep motivated being here? Ooh, it does make sense. And, you know, you're talking to somebody who left New York, and I have no plans on going back. I might not stay in Detroit for forever, but I know I'm not going back there. And so, which like New York being like, go to New York, they'll get a career, blue. Nah, like no interest. And so I think it's important to think about your long-term goals more than anything, and determining the place where you want to be based on those long-term goals or the opportunities you want to seek. I think that Detroit is garnering more attention as an arts mecca, specifically like in the last 5 years. I think there's been a lot more investment in Detroit, but I also think it's important to travel and see the world and do other things. And so now that we're in the age of COVID, where technically you don't have to be anywhere, I could be in Antarctica right now for all we know. Like, it doesn't really matter where you are. Thinking about Detroit maybe as a home base, and then looking at those things, those other places where you want to go, is to me the best idea. Like now I'm, you know, I left New York and now I'm based in Detroit, but I'll always be a New Yorker. And so not running away or shying away from that. I do think it's important to establish yourself locally and to build that local network so you have that net to catch you when you finish. Like, and I would say that for any city where any of you all land, like creating your support where you're at is so important. And being in a place where you know you can leave and return and that support will still be there. But I would not shy away. Like, you can be a Detroit artist and be in Japan for a year, and there's nothing wrong with that. Because no matter where you go, there you are. And Detroit is a part of you. So it's gonna be in there no matter what. But also don't sleep on the small residencies that are in major cities. Just saying. There's a lot, like, I would say residencies are where I get a ton. So much work gets done. I try to do a residency a year, and that's partially because I have such a crazy schedule with the curatorial work that I need that time where I'm just in my practice. And so I'll be going back to Acre this summer, and then I'll be at Anderson Ranch in the spring, or next spring. And that's in Colorado. Anderson Arts is in Colorado, and then Acres in Wisconsin. And just remembering that, like, it's not only the major cities that can help foster your careers.
Other questions, folks? So, oh yeah, go Lilith.
So like this question is not necessarily like connect to your practice, but like I'm just like kind of curious, what's your opinions on the Richard Prince exhibition that MoCA did in 2019 that, you know, because you talk about, because you pay your models, even like, yeah, it's not one-time things, like you give them their part of ownership, but like, you know, but what Richard Prince did was kind of,
yeah, you know, it's funny because I worked so hard on Crossing Night, which I think, not just because I curated it, but I think that show was a stronger show, and it makes me so sad that it was so diluted by Richard Prince. Richard is a very sweet man, super nice, super smart, and super problematic. And you can be both, and it can be both. And, you know, I, as somebody who also appropriates images in my work, I think there is a conversation about appropriation, specifically in photography in the age of the internet, that is worth having. And so, like, you know, technically anybody can be a photographer. We're all photographers. The minute you post something on social media, then you become a photographer somehow. And so I think, if you think about what he's doing, it's an important conversation that actually we all should be having. But if you're asking me if I enjoy every show that is presented by the museum, the answer is no. I think curation, there's some shows that I love that I work on, and then there's some shows that I'm not as invested in. And so that's also navigating institutional life, right? Like some shows were decided years before I got there. Some shows I got to have a say in. And so this season, for example, is a mixture. Like one of the shows I didn't decide, the other shows that I worked on, I did. Next season will be the same thing. I think it's not going to be until 2022 that the shows will finally be shows that I helped determine that they're going to be at the museum. Again, there's like sprinkles of shows that are happening in between where it was definitely my choice, but you know, a museum is also an ecosystem with board members and senior leadership and community folks who are really invested. And so in terms of Richard Prince, simply stated, that show was complicated for me. And I think we had like 20 artists participate in crossing night, all from different races, different genders across the continent of Africa. And for us to have 5 of those artists appear in town the same day that a Richard Prince show is open, and to have that show those artists not receive, they're like the most established African photographers, to have that show receive nothing, and all this investment in Richard Prince, I think reflects society's priorities. Yeah.
Anybody else? Then thank you very much, Jova. It was really great to have you tonight.
I'm so happy I got to be here. Thank you so much, Mark. I'm so excited for tomorrow and meeting more of you.
More fiber, yes, indeed.
Yes.
All right.
All
Well,
right.
let you get some rest tonight so that you're ready to go tomorrow.
Ready to go. See y'all in the morning.
See everybody
Bye.
later.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.